Welcome, everyone. If you could just please take a seat. And as you're seating, please move to the inside of the aisles so that latecomers can sit on the ends. think we have a critical mass here. So everybody can take their seats. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, battling traffic, road enclosures, and calls for the collapse of multilateralism. I'm Hila Rasool. I'm Director of Planetary Politics at New America, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my two colleagues up on the stage. Minh-Thu Pham, CEO of Project Starling, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America. Thank you.
All right.
Ooh, the lights are down.
Ooh, the lights are down. All right. Good evening,
but we
everyone.
can see you in case you're thinking of sleeping.
That's right. That's right. All right. So as Hila mentioned, so Minh-Thu Pham, I am the proud co-founder and CEO of Project Starling, which is a new think and do tank. We're mostly the do side of it, which is essentially to try to bring the right people together at the right time to talk about how we collaborate to solve these big problems together. And we're called Project Starling because it's starling as in the murmurations of birds in the sky and how they harmoniously collaborate with one another. Scientists are still trying to figure out how they work together, but that's how we think international cooperation should work. And we're so thrilled to co-host this with Anne-Marie, Hila, and the folks over at New America. The purpose of tonight, we have a deliberately provocative topic, is on what a global order of middle powers would look like. And essentially, it's a challenge to us all to think about what should the multilateral system look like? How should it operate? And what are some new ideas or a different vision for the way that we should all be working together? In a world of really big challenges and where it feels like the world is moving further apart rather than working together, that we really do need to think about a different way of working. And so that's the challenge to our opening provocation speakers tonight, our lightning talks, as well as to all of you. We want this to be a collaborative and interactive conversation despite the auditorium. I hope you all can just sort of imagine that you're around a large round table together and that we're all really exploring these questions together. And so what are the questions that we're here to address? First is to really think about what it would mean to reimagine a new global order rather than attempt to try to reinforce the former status quo and return to this former status quo. Secondly, should a reimagined order be based on shared universal values, and what should those be? I think in a world where everyone comes up with their new realities and we have information silos, sometimes it's harder to understand whether we do still operate from a shared sense of common and universal values. And I think just looking at the speeches earlier today, I think it really is important for us to maybe revisit those and to think about what those might be. And then lastly, what are the new coalitions and alliances and partnerships that then need to happen to do that? So with that, let me ask Anne-Marie to lead us off with some framing thoughts and your own opening provocations. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Minh-Thu. I actually had the great pleasure of teaching Minh-Thu a long time ago. So first of all, welcome. And this is the second time that we have done this. And I have been reflecting all day on the difference between last year and this year. Last year, I was here as a member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on effective multilateralism. And we had been part of an extensive process feeding into the Pact for the Future. The president of Google was at the UN, arm in arm with the UN representatives talking about AI. And it's not that we thought the Pact for the Future was going to be the next San Francisco agreement. We were realists, but had the November election and other elections turned out differently, there was a recognition that an awful lot had to change, and this was an effort to really develop blueprints for that change. You know, that didn't happen. This year, the mood is very, very different. This year, I would say all the people who have been writing the multilateral system is breaking are now writing it is broken. And it is time then to see what we're going to do. It is broken. I do agree that it is broken, at least this part of it. There are lots of other parts that are not. But we have not yet had, and I dread, the magnitude of the crisis that drove either the creation of the League or the San Francisco Agreement, which of course was signed after the end of war in Europe, after VE Day, but before the dropping of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, but there was plenty of crisis. Tens of millions of people had died. We do not want that kind of crisis, but I'm not sure that we are where we need to be in terms of that impulse. So then I want to frame remarks, that impulse toward action and leadership. I'm going to talk about middle powers. We're all going to talk about middle powers. Lots of us are studying middle powers and seeing what they can do. But I sometimes look at other nations and feel like it's been like 60 years of Pavlov's dog, that people have been conditioned to wait for the United States to do something or some other great power to do something. The leaders of many of these middle powers, which include very large powers, obviously India and Brazil and South Africa, and many others, are like leaders everywhere. They're ambitious, they're successful, they have taken the lead, but they do not have that sense that I think any of us who have served in the US government have had, that it's kind of up to us. There's a crisis, we have to do something. And that has been ingrained for generations, and it is no longer true, and it isn't just Trump. I honestly think for the foreseeable future, the United States has plenty to deal with at home. So other countries have to see themselves as leaders. So let me say a couple of things about middle powers. First of all, I mean, it's a very funny category. It essentially means big countries who are not the United States, Russia, or China. And the EU is a great power, but it doesn't act like a great power often. It does in economic areas, obviously not in security. And so we're still looking at the EU as a quasi-great power, and the big powers in Europe, Poland, France, Germany, the UK is not part of the EU, they're middle powers. But also, and we're looking at the big BRICS, but we're looking at the other G20 members, at Turkey, at Indonesia. We're looking also at countries like Norway and Canada. They're not big powers. Canada's quite a bit bigger than Norway. But Norway, for instance, in development, is what I would think of as a middle power. We're looking at Spain. And then we're thinking about, and this is the part I find really exciting, linking those together with, it's not the global south, global north, or west and the rest division. And that opens up lots of possibilities, because suddenly you're thinking about what are the interests of these nations in a specific area of development, of global policy. How can they come together and then mobilize others? So many of you who've either had to read my work because I taught you or chose to read my work know that much of it has been around the shift from hierarchy to network, from dominance, the power of dominance of command and control, to the power of connection. Really from the sort of power of military might to the legitimacy, the convening power, and the ability to connect across difference that many actors, not just powers, have. If we think about that world, I actually think a networked world, there are many different visions of it. I originally used the atlas at Rockefeller Center, who's holding up that globe with all those different wonderful strands. But you can also think about it as kind of armadillo world, where we have just multiple overlapping levels of groups who come together with other nations, with many other actors, just like New York this week, to work on specific areas. And if you think about that, then suddenly you see these powers, and I think with many global actors that are not states as well, not as the kind of, you know, middle powers of the global system, the powers that kind of join, but as architects, as hubs, powers coming together and saying, we are going to create a hub here for the development of this region, for a set of climate issues, for a set of labor issues and migration issues. Some of those will come from the regional organizations, but I think many of them will come from who comes together, and critically, and here I will invite the rest of the discussion to begin, critically, who stands up and thinks, I'm not waiting for anybody. I am a global leader. That's really what we need. With that, I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to join me on stage. Minh-Thu's going to introduce you, and you can come on up.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. So I'm going to ask our opening provocation speakers to come up. Zain Dangoor is the Director General for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. And I'll speak in the order that you're coming in. So I think you're there next to Anne-Marie. And you know what? Let me just make sure you also have this microphone. Yes, you will. Hang on one second. Let me introduce everyone first. Okay. All right. And then, let's see. So next we have Stewart Patrick, Director of the, and yes, watch your...
President.
A leader.
That's a really way to provoke the audience. Fall over on your feet. Stewart Patrick is the Director of the Global Order and Institutions Program and my colleague at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I'm proudly a non-resident scholar. Mariana Mazzucato, economist, and I think many of you may have read her stuff. Also very much looking forward to her comments. Richard Gowan, UN Director at the International Crisis Group. Martín Abregú, Vice President at the Ford Foundation. Kate Higgins, CEO of Cooperation Canada. And Amitabh Behar, Executive Director of Oxfam International. Fantastic. So we've asked each of these folks to lead us off with their opening provocation, essentially lightning talks to provoke us all to think about what a global order should look like. And I'll say that from my perspective, I think this moment of flux, this moment of change and transition on the global stage is actually a really interesting moment of opportunity. And that's where really the entry point for this conversation. How do we take what's kind of happening on the global stage and what we're seeing and try to steer that in the direction of a principled multilateral order? So let me start with asking Zain to come up and give us his 3-minute lightning talk, and then we'll move on to Stewart. Our timer's right here. All right. Yes, please, go ahead. You have a microphone? Yep. If you would like. However you'd like. I think it might be nice if you stand up and then we can see you. There you go.
Thanks. Good evening. It's good to be here. So maybe the best way for me to start off by being provocative is to contrast two statements of the UN today that talks about the different worlds that we can imagine. So the one was by the President of the US, and then there was one from the Prime Minister of Slovenia. And if you contrast those two statements, you actually look at a picture of what we don't want and what we should imagine what we want. So I was going to talk about a whole lot of things, the martial culture. I mean, Jonathan Schell, in his book, The Unconquerable World, spoke about the two competing impulses in humanity. The one impulse is one that glorified war, and the outcomes of that is colonialism. And he contrasts that to the other competing impulse in humanity, which is peace and cooperation. Right? And the argument is that the impulse that glorifies war, the martial culture, is the dominant one. And what we heard in the one statement was glorifying that martial culture, power, domination, whereas the Slovenian Prime Minister spoke about the need for middle powers to come together around cooperation. And what you come together around is in defense of certain things, but also to promote a world where human rights, dignity, The well-being of all overrides competition and might is right. The Secretary General echoed similar issues, and I think the Secretary General's words was, we're moving into a really multipolar world, lots of powers, but multipolarity without multilateralism is dangerous, because where do you then find the institutions that can engage, where the powers can engage with each other? So part of what I think we need to do is work with the statements that we heard from the PM of Slovenia and look at how do we as middle powers get together. So that statement comes 2 years ago. We had a similar discussion in Finland, where our South Africa and a few other small European states, outside of the power block of the EU, felt that we needed to come together, because middle powers essentially, and I think I agree with your definition of what constitutes middle powers, but if you look at the big players, right, so might is right, is you shape the world in your image because you have military power or economic power or both. Middle powers tend not to have the kind of economic power that they can bully the world or weaponize elements of economic power to shape the world in their image, or to bend you to that particular will, or you cannot use your military power. What we depend on is the institutions of global governance, and which is the multilateral system, which is, I think you said, broken. And part of what we need to do is, how does middle powers, because without global governance, without the institutions that are flawed, we don't have the protections of international law, or even the normative framework around what is right and what is wrong. We cannot use, for example, the apex courts to protect us, or the UN. And we see exactly what is happening now is that destruction. It was ignored for many years, but now there's willful destruction of these institutions. So my provocation is, let's build and improve what we have, because starting anew might just provide the space for the big powers who don't want this kind of the UN and the institutions of the UN to operate effectively. And we saw that statement today was intentionally rubbishing the UN and multilateralism. We need to defend multilateralism, we need to reform it, but we also need to make sure that we provide the space for middle powers to shape this new multilateralism. The genesis of the UN was to protect empires, former colonial powers, the victors of World War II, right? And that we see in the manner in which the P5 is constructed and how rules in the UN. For example, we can't reform the charter without all the members of the P5 agreeing to minor changes. So you can't change the structure of the UN Security Council without changing the fact that any changes to the charter requires all the P5 to agree. So my mild provocation then is, let's reform what we have. Let's make sure that we create the space for middle powers to come together outside perhaps of the UN and form a cross-regional bloc that is based on advocating for human rights, dignity, equality, peace over war. I'll end there and provoke you a bit more later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And with that provocation, I think also thinking then what parts of the system do we still want to retain and what parts do we change? With that, let me ask Stewart to come up.
Thank you very much, and to Minh-Thu and to Anne-Marie for this fantastic opportunity. Also, really like those last comments, and I think we should get the President of the United States together with the Prime Minister of Slovenia. If only there were a Slovenian in the White House who might be able to help on that. I do want to, this is I share this view that Minh-Thu expressed, this great moment of opportunity. It's obviously a moment of peril. Without significant reform, the United Nations could go to the way of the League of Nations. You have a United States that has gone from benevolent, in its own view at least, to malevolent hegemony, and it's basically pursuing a policy of dominance as disruption and the international rule of law is under attack. It is, however, a moment of great promise. And I think one of the things that's happened with the fluidity that's been introduced is precisely this opportunity of cross-regional and grouping cooperation amongst middle powers that have for too long been frozen in amber. I would, to use an analogy that maybe picks up on what Anne-Marie was talking about, for a long time, you've had middle powers who have been playing second fiddle to the great powers. They have been, in a sense, hiding behind them in the orchestra, and now is their opportunity to come out and take center stage and make their voices heard. And I think that there's a number of reasons for optimism about that. Back in 2008, when you've had the G20 rise to the level of leaders, there was great optimism that one of the great things about the G20 was that it could provide flexible coalitions of interest that spanned countries at different levels of development. You could get cooperation between France and Indonesia, say, or Germany and Brazil, et cetera. For a number of reasons, that promise was not borne out. But I think today things are different in both the North and the South. Let's begin with the South. When BRICS first expanded, there was fear amongst many in the West that there would be a situation where the BRICS would consolidate as an even larger group in kind of an anti-Western bloc. I think those fears were always overwrought, and of course, time has sort of shown that basically the vast majority of members of the BRICS countries, whether it's Indonesia or Brazil or India, what have you, have no desire to replace American hegemony for Chinese hegemony or to form rigid blocs. They're interested in multi-alignment. So that's an interesting development. The other thing that's going on, of course, is that the West itself is going through a major crisis. The West, or the North, as we always often think about it. And the Trump presidency, Trump 2.0, has really accelerated that development. So you have a situation where Ursula von der Leyen, in April of this year, says the West, as we have known it, has ceased to exist. And so, again, I think that the America's allies are not going to leave the United States, the alliance structure, but they are certainly diversifying their portfolios, as well they should at this moment, right? They're hedging their bets, like all good investors would and should. So this double dynamic creates openings for middle powers, and indeed, multilateralism is not standing still. We saw this in Sevilla and elsewhere. Just because the United States is leaving the field, others are adopting what I believe Indonesian diplomats have called the U2 doctrine. We're going to move forward with or without you. And so we're seeing these dynamics. Partly this is about playing short-term defense on the part of middle powers, right, in global bodies, because the United States may alternately play a range of roles, right? It may be objector, it may be spoiler, it may be defector, it may be periodic cooperator, or it may be even erstwhile conservative reformer trying to rally other conservative nationalist governments to try to remake multilateralism. And there is a major prospect that we will enter a world of illiberal multilateralism, which we have not seen for quite some time, and which is quite dangerous. Back in Trump 1.0, France and Germany famously launched their alliance for multilateralism. That didn't really go anywhere, in part because it was only a European initiative, or at least led by European initiatives, but it was directionally correct and appropriate. World needs something similar today, and this is my provocation, to be bolder and more, something like that, but bolder and more inclusive. A partnership for multilateralism that would include middle powers from the global north and global south, rather than a cohesive bloc. It would be a flexible network, open in principle to all of those who are committed to the Charter principles that bring the vision, the will, and importantly, at least some measure of capacity to make a difference. It would not require nations to abandon their partnerships, but it would provide a platform, a hub, if you will, in Maria's terms, to launch high ambition coalitions. I don't want to sugarcoat the obstacles, and we can talk about those. Countries that are middle powers are divided on many, many different things. But it is something that I think that the moment is ripe for. Thank you.
Thanks, Stewart. Okay, Mariana Mazzucato.
Right. So I think the provocation is to make sure that middle doesn't mean mediocre. And so how do we make sure that this concept of middle power, which should be about taking seriously what it means not to do what we know has actually caused this huge crisis in multilateralism, how do we hold certain principles to account and double down on it, almost be proud that these words like equity, sustainability, solidarity, which as Zane knows are actually the themes that this year are above all the different working groups inside the G20. What does it mean to hold those to account? Think actually of the Human Rights Declaration. We've had that for a long time. Do we hold that to account in how we build housing and how we build cities? We don't. So maybe this is the opportunity. And just some examples, and all my examples are actually from the so-called middle powers, some of which you named. So think of what's happening, for example, in South Africa with the mRNA hub, right? This is a hub, it's a network. It's a knowledge collaboration, but instead of just using the word partnership, collaboration, innovation, ecosystem, they're doubling down on what it means to truly collaborate. What does it mean to create an innovation system where we really share the knowledge? What does it mean to play back the tape of COVID and realize what a failure that was? People talk about the vaccine as though that was a success, right? Because those 8 vaccines came out really quick. But what was the mission? It wasn't to have 8 vaccines. It was to make those vaccines accessible to the world. And only one of those vaccines actually was a fruit of a collaboration that put issues around equity and solidarity at the center. And that was because the publicly funded researchers at Oxford actually put it as a condition to their collaboration with AstraZeneca to share the knowledge. And this mRNA hub now in South Africa is putting those principles that are concrete, that are holding that innovation collaboration accountable to the principle of solidarity in how they innovate in this pre-distributive way, right? Instead of waiting for redistribution to share all the wealth, how do we actually produce wealth? How do we create knowledge? How do we innovate with those principles at the center? Another, in Europe, and this is more of a damning point that it's not being done, we have something that looks really green. It's called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, right? And we talk about sustainability, again, at the G20. But to make sure that the CBAM treaty has equity, sustainability, and solidarity at the center, it must have knowledge sharing and technology transfer at the center of it. Otherwise, what looks good for one middle power, Europe, is terrible for the so-called global south. I don't like those words. I don't know if later we can think of better words to use. And lastly, the work that actually I'm doing right now for the COP, I'm part of this economics council for COP. One of the things that I'll be bringing to the council at COP is, unless we build state capacity, none of the things that we're talking about here are going to work. I just read a book again, called The Big Con, How the Consulting Industry Has Infantilized Our Governments, and I can tell you much more about that. We've McKinseyfied, or anyway. And Brazil, again, is a really interesting country where they've really doubled down on state, not state like leadership and state governance mechanisms. They talk about governance, but the details, the nitty-gritty, procurement, digital public infrastructure, rethinking state-owned enterprises. So middle powers as learning from each other. What does it mean to do state-owned enterprises differently? ESCOM, Petrobras, right? A different relationship, not only between public and private, as I was alluding to for these innovation collaborations, but also public and public. How do we actually govern the state-owned enterprises so it's actually part of the solution and not part of the problem? And really interesting examples globally. But that means that we actually have to have values at the center of that learning. And I think the provocation is not only to double down on those words that are about values, but to learn from each other. So of course it has to be networked, but these need to be learning organizations, learning what it means, for example, to rethink procurement, the 13 trillion in the world on the demand side, to actually deliver a more sustainable, more solidarity, more equitable world. Thank you.
Okay, I love this. All right, Richard Gowan, Crisis Group.
Okay. So my provocation is to ask, who will keep us safe in a middle power world? Because I completely agree with Stewart and others that we are already actually in many policy fields entering the sort of flexible order that Anne-Marie described. And we are in a world where countries are accepting that on a lot of issues, like this year's pandemics treaty, you do have to work with an international community -1. You are going to have to negotiate on a lot of topics without the US in the room, at least for the time being. But I think there's one policy field where that doesn't work, and that is peace and security. And so the question is, could a coalition of middle powers find ways to keep the world safe in an increasingly dangerous context where we actually have more wars than we've had in any year since, I think, the end of the Cold War? It seems, it reminds me of a story about FDR in the 1930s, President Roosevelt. And in the mid-1930s, he had a bright idea, which was he was going to get the middle powers of Europe, like Sweden, to gang together to try and persuade Hitler to stop invading places. And one of his advisors said to him, Mr. President, this is like asking a group of psychoanalysts to deal with Al Capone. And I once told that anecdote, and there was an Austrian in the room who was like, what is wrong with psychoanalysts? So no offense to those of you who export them. But it is a question. Could a group of middle powers really restrain the big powers in a turbulent world? Now, I sort of see three different middle power responses to this question. And actually, I think Zain described the first one, which is an institutionalist response. You know, we try and keep the existing system of UN peacekeeping, mediation, and international law alive. And we've seen that, for example, in South Africa's attempt to get the ICJ to play a greater role over Gaza. And I do actually think there is still a case for institutions, because what we have found in places like Haiti right now is that if you attempt to do peacekeeping without the backup of the UN system, you get a mess. So actually, there are some things that the UN doesn't do super well, but it does it better than most other places. So maybe we do need to defend the institutions. I think there's a second strand of thought, which is regionalism. That increasingly middle powers will essentially build spheres in which they can lead politically and try and keep the big powers at arm's length. And I see that, for example, in the way that ASEAN is approaching Myanmar. The third strand of activity is entrepreneurialism, because there are some middle powers, Turkey is one, Qatar another, that are actually increasingly acting as peacemakers and getting involved in security dilemmas beyond their neighborhoods. Qatar is negotiating in Colombia, or mediating in Colombia. Turkey has been mediating in the Philippines, far beyond their regional zones. So it may actually be that there's a group of middle powers that really can do a lot of the mediation work and peacemaking work that once we would have left to the UN. So I think there are different ways forward, but I think we have to debate which of those ways forward has the highest chance of keeping us safe. And I would just end by saying the answer is not Security Council reform, because it is not going to happen.
All right. Martín from the Ford Foundation.
Is it okay if I just stay sitting? Okay, thank you. So I guess my provocation here will be to describe what a global order of middle powers would look like as an archipelago. And what do I mean by an archipelago? And here I'm using a definition of actually a Spanish cultural magazine of the 90s that had this definition of archipelago that I love. It says an archipelago is a group of islands united by what separates them. Okay? All right, so what does that mean? This means that these middle powers do not have a shared vision or a shared project. But they are united by what separates them from the bigger, the older powers, and actually the smaller power too, right? They joint identity is basically determined by contrast to what they are not, okay? And even though they all see the benefits of being part of something larger, in this case the archipelago, they all like to be part of, to be their own island. Okay, they all like to be an island, right? So the dynamics of such a relation actually are mostly transactional and opportunistic, right? The enemy of my enemy may or may not be my friend. The friend of my friend may or may not be my enemy, right? And it's also important to stress that these islands do not have the same size, the same power, the same resources. They all need each other in some way, but they need each other in very different ways, okay? So what would a global order like that mean for those of us seeking to engage with some set of values? I am afraid that the most obvious consequence is that many of the rules and principles that we were used to will no longer apply, right? That could be a bad thing at many levels, and I think we all know that. And as has been described here, there can be an opportunity too. The dichotomy between global north and global south may not be that important anymore. The distinction between developed and developing countries will not apply. The line between donor and receiving countries will be blurred. You know, so there are some things that we can work, but we will need to embrace the fact that there are not going to be like good actors, or that some of the rules-based systems that can come up with all these transactional relationships may not be necessarily fair. Okay? So basically, I would say some of the fictions of the past would not apply. So I'm not saying that we are already there, so I'm not describing the world that we are in, but I do think that there is a world of middle powers that could look like something like that. So what are a few potential principles of what can we do engaging in this context? First, I think we will need to embrace transactional relationships with these middle powers. And we will need to do a much better job at listening to their interests and doing our homework to ensure that our priorities align. You know, Mariana was describing a lot of opportunities. I think we can find them, but we will have to do our homework. Where are those opportunities? Yeah, I'm sorry. We will have to look for those opportunities. They are going to be, you know, there's some homework there to be done. There may be opportunities for value-based engagement, but that would need a level of trust that we will need to work really hard to build. I don't think we are there. Second, as we envision the future of global systems, the first question in a context like this is who gets to design it? You know, so far, you know, yes, there have been a lot of talking about designing global systems that are more inclusive, but actually the processes to design those global systems have not been inclusive. So we do have a problem of, you know, like, how are we going to be designing those new systems in a middle power global order? And the third thing I would say is we should put people at the center of any future global governance system. And, you know, and I think that in that sense, the rules and the structure that we have created, you know, need to be paying more attention on all the things that we know in terms of how, you know, women are more impacted by financial shocks, how racial and ethnic minorities are more impacted, you know, in terms of systemic barriers, in terms of participation. We all know that. So how are we putting all of that at the center of our global systems, not as an afterthought? So, and for some of us, actually, this is a piece that I think there is an opportunity, because for some of us, centering on people may be a matter of values, but for these middle power governments, centering on people may be a matter of survival. So if we do a good job in terms of putting people at the center, we may have an interesting opportunity. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Martin. Let me just say, I think some people are still coming in, so if you do have the ability to move to your left, that would be great, or we can also just send folks to the front. Kate Higgins from Cooperation Canada. Go ahead.
Thank you.
And of course, you are welcome to stand in the front if you'd like. Up to you.
Well, it's pretty comfortable here, huh? Yeah, okay. So thank you for the invitation. It's been a really inspiring discussion so far. And I think the way that Martin talked about kind of people, I think is maybe a good transition to some of the things I want to reflect on and maybe that Amitabh will say. Just to start, I think it's important maybe just to situate where I work and what I do, because I think it will really reflect kind of the tone and tenor of my comments. So Cooperation Canada is the national independent coalition and umbrella group of Canadian international development and humanitarian organizations. We have over 100 members. They are all civil society organizations, and we work and push Canada to be ambitious in its global engagement. So my reflections will be anchored in the role of Canada as a middle power, but I hope that it can be applicable as we think of other middle powers in the world. Now, I think it's fair to say that Canada has been considered a fairly typical and fortunate middle power that benefited from a multilateral system that was developed by a few people and was pretty good for Canada. And I think that there is pride for Canadians and Canada in ways that the country and Canadians have contributed to the multilateral system. So whether that's the Ottawa Treaty on banning landmines, whether that's decades ago the Pearson Commission on International Cooperation, whether that's the Montreal Protocol on tackling the ozone layer, these are areas where Canada stepped up, and Canadians are proud of that contribution. And we know that nostalgia is not a strategy. Nostalgia is not a way forward. And the multilateral system is in crisis. And Canada and Canadians have a choice to make about whether we want to step up and step in and be part of a reformed system. And I think, as we've discussed, the retreat of some countries, including the US, maybe offers space for us to reimagine what those contributions can look like. And I am going to use my time to structure my comments around 3 Ps. My daughter told me this would be helpful to kind of maintain all of your attention. And that is pathfinder, practice, and purpose. So here I go. Now, our Prime Minister Carney, Mark Carney, gave kind of one of his first foreign policy speeches yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations. And his message was very clear that Canada needs to focus. And I guess my provocation is that could Canada and middle powers be pathfinders in particular areas where multilateralism makes sense and where that country, in this case Canada, has something particular to offer? So in the case of Canada, could that be around international financial system reform, migration and protection, global health, civic space? We can think about what those issues are, but is this an opportunity for middle powers to identify areas where they actually want to step up and be a pathfinder, acknowledging that middle powers can't be engaged and do it all? I have heard more times than I would like over the last few months from Canadian politicians, decision makers. Canada can't fill the gap that others are leaving. But there is an opportunity for us to step into some of those gaps and make a difference. My second P is practice. Can middle powers engage in the practice of multilateralism in a way that innovates and kind of really moves the needle? And I think for this, we need to go kind of from dialogue to actual impact. So many of you around the room and people that I can see in the audience have talked about the importance of networked multilateralism, coalition building, more flexible kind of networks and hubs. Mariana gave some really good examples of how this is working in practice. So how can middle powers actually practice the practice of multilateralism in a way that makes a difference? And my final point is around purpose. And this is where I feel we have lost the way a little bit. Because we need to demonstrate to Canadians that multilateralism has a direct impact and is important for their lives. And if I'm honest, those of us that engage in civil society spaces, I think have spent too much time on insider political influencing and not enough time talking to Canadians and talking to people around why global engagement and the connection between global engagement and their lives matters. So that is some of our homework. If we are actually going to, I think, push middle powers to really engage in a reformed multilateral system, we need to put people in this at the center, and we need to demonstrate to them that it makes a difference.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, Amitabh from Oxfam International.
Thank you. So I will build on what you said. But let me say my provocation is that we are going to be tinkering around the edges if we are talking of a new order with middle powers. There's a more fundamental transformation that we need to talk about. And I think that's what I would want to talk about within those 3 minutes. Absolutely, the global multilateral order is absolutely broken. And I know that this audience knows, but just, I think emotionally, it's important to let me just say, Gaza. And what does it bring to all of us? When you see forced starvation, genocide, I think it's, it really makes the complete shattering of multilateralism brutally naked in front of us. Let's remember that. What has really happened is, as in I can go on talking about what's happened, but I'll not go into that at this juncture. What's really happened is a complete breakdown of the post-World War liberal consensus. I think that's really the most critical piece. So if you're looking at any conversation, we need to recognize that the ideas which have pretty much governed us, at least the normative consensus around UDHR, around rule of law, international humanitarian law, that's all shattered at this moment. So what is that we need to look at? That's the fundamental question. And till you start looking at the economic model that we have, I think, rest all is going to be tinkering. It is really the economic model that needs a reboot. So at this moment, we talk of multiple things. It's the inequality crisis. And when you look at the inequality, what we are essentially seeing is, I would say already we are seeing a new order of oligarchies all around, built around chaos. So it's really the oligarchies that are going to define what multilateralism is going to look like. So the first piece is, how do you get over the TINA factor of the neoliberal system? There's no alternative. I think if we're not going to challenge that, if we're not going to fundamentally challenge this, that there's no alternative, it's unlikely that you will create a new global order. It's going to be the same order. Maybe the names will change in 30 years, 40 years. So that's really the big question. Look at the poly crisis. We keep talking about the climate crisis, the hunger crisis, the food crisis. It is the same economic system, the extractive greed, which leads to the crisis that we are looking at. So what do we need to do? Very quickly, a couple of thoughts. One, there are still many progressive elements at this moment. How do we work with them? We have seen the Surveil Platform for Action, G20, taxing the rich. There are real possibilities now. We started with a very dark multilateral year, but there are opportunities at this moment. You see that in G20, in South Africa, in Belém, COP, and we already saw that in Seville. So that's something that we need to really start working on. But the bigger point is, we need a broader rainbow coalition. And that rainbow coalition is not about just us civil society groups or even just academics coming together. It is about that alternative normative framework that many of us have talked of, which is built around human dignity, which is about ensuring security for everyone, human rights for everyone, and building an equal and just society. So that's really the fundamental piece. I think it's time that if you are looking at a new order, it is about ending the Wall Street consensus. It's not going to work. It's very clear. Let me say, that's where the new order is already showing. I come from India. One of the reasons why I didn't talk of middle order, Martin. But just look around my country. In just last 1.5 years, 3 governments have been overthrown. Sri Lanka, I hope you remember the pictures, common citizens entering the presidential house, jumping into the presidential swimming pool. I loved it. Bangladesh, the Prime Minister had to take a helicopter and run to Delhi. And we have just seen 2 weeks ago in Nepal. And this is happening in Indonesia as well. So there is a citizen's anger that you're seeing around on this inequality. The existing framework will not work. There's chaos around it. And till we address the economic fundamental questions of how we are organizing our political economy, changes are not going to happen. So it is about looking at the century of citizens' action, which might give us some new global order. Thanks.
Okay, so lots of great thoughts and even analogies on the table. Let me see if there are reactions in the room and other thoughts and contributions. And there is a microphone. Josh has that. I recognize that this is not the most efficient setup, so we may have to have you passing microphones down. But let me start maybe in the back here. Oh, good. Thanks for the lights. With our gentleman from Global Nation, Zach, and we'll start in the back, and then we'll come, and then I think maybe on the left side of the room, and then Ben and Rebecca here. Go ahead. Yep. Do you have a microphone? Yep, right here.
Great. Hi, I'm Josh Glatzer. I'm representing Global Nation tonight. This was really excellent. Thank you for your time. Wondering if each of you could speak to whether there should be a litmus test for democracy or at least non-autocracy among countries in the middle power bloc, and why or why not?
Thanks so much. And thanks for also demonstrating the efficiency that we want to have everyone make their comments. So contributions, it doesn't have to just be questions, but also I will cut you off if I need to. Zach, and then yeah.
Hi, everybody. Zach Burton, now with Princeton University. Nice to see everybody. I'm going to structure my question around 3 Ps. And that is, it's in response to a provocation from our friend Mr. Stewart Patrick, and it concerns a kind of parallelism. And that is, Stewart, I really like your idea about a flexible partnership for multilateralism, an expanded one based on the European model involving states from north and south organizing around specific issues. We could almost also call it the United Nations. And I say that as a setup to my question. In this formulation, your provocation, which I like, what happens in that context to the United Nations? Given this institution we all care about, we feel like is on fumes at the moment. If states are investing in this alternative structure, does that mean they necessarily divest from the institution itself? Thanks.
You guys are so efficient. You can actually speak a little bit longer. So, okay. So we have, actually, sorry, I missed this one up here. And then we're going to come down to Ben and Casito. Great. Thank you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. Okay, hi, I'm Allison Holder from Equal Measures, and we're a global coalition tracking progress on gender equality. So when I saw the theme of this session, my question in my mind was, what would the middle powers bring, or what would a world look like from a gender equality perspective? When thinking about middle powers, and maybe just why it matters is I think gender equal countries are ones that are investing in public services, tackling discriminatory laws, shifting norms, etc. And I thought it was interesting to look at within our index that just some of the countries that have come up here, so Brazil, India, South Africa, and dare I say Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are ones that were moving really rapidly in the right direction on our most recent global gender index. And countries like Canada, France, the Netherlands were stagnating, and the US was one of a small group of countries that was moving in the wrong direction on gender equality. So just to kind of pose the question back to the panel, would a global order of middle powers be a more gender equal world?
All right, great. Okay, Ben and Casito.
Thanks. I'm Ben Phillips. I work on multilateralism. Multilateralism is kind of in my bones, so I say this with love. It's about us. If the only people booing at us were right-wing citizens of the US, that would be bad, but it's so much worse than that. Why are people all across the world booing at us? And how will we win back the public, including the public in middle powers, so that they are cheering this mission, and that starts to drown out some of the boos that we might still continue to get from right-wingers in the US?
Ben, can you just hang on to that microphone for a second? How would you answer that question?
I would humbly ask them, and I would also anticipate that in order to win people back, I would probably need not only to advertise my product better, but to change the product.
Okay, great. Casito.
Thank you all for the panel. So Kizito Bianchia with Open Society Foundations. I do our multilateral work. I'm curious because when we speak about multilateralism, we often always gravitate towards the level of the state. So I would love for you just to expand a little bit more below that. And it goes to Ben's question about people. What other levels can we look at for global cooperation beyond the state level?
Okay, Casito, I'm going to ask you also to hang on to that microphone and answer your own question. When we were setting this up, we realized there are people in the audience who are just as knowledgeable and with as good ideas as the folks on the stage. So this is not a Q&A. This is for you to also provide your own thoughts. So Casito, any more that you want to elaborate on that? How would you also go down on other levels?
So quickly, I see it as we're all in it together. So you have to weave that fabric. So beyond just what's happening at a governmental level, head of state level, where are mayors and municipalities meeting together on these issues of global cooperation? Where are local governments meeting? But then importantly, where are we building that fabric between societies to do so? It's something where we have to look at from a bottom-up measure, not only just top-down.
Okay, great. Rebecca, eyes.
Thank you so much, Rebecca Shute. I think I'll mostly be speaking from the lens of the co-convener of an impact coalition on strengthening international judicial institutions, although I wear some other hats. So I would like to come back and perhaps unite some of the comments of Mr. Patrick, Mr. Gowan, and also loop in Canada a little bit, and some of Casita's comments as well. Whether civil society, whether non-state actors, whether small states, not just middle states. What we have seen recently is a phenomenon of small states driving international justice. We can all think of the recent advisory opinion with the ICJ, and I think that is perhaps the tip of the iceberg. Mr. Patrick, I think you gestured at one point in your remarks that our institutions are not preserved in amber. We should not be tempted to think of them that way. These are human-made, actually, no, they are man-made institutions, and therefore should be seen as malleable and subject to change, including UN Security Council reform, perhaps. Tomorrow we will have a convening of an Article 109 impact coalition that is looking at this in a very live way and joining this to Canada now. I commend to everybody's attention. I'm honored to work with Honorable Lloyd Axworthy, former foreign minister, and our Honorable Alan Rock, former Minister of Justice, on veto reform, on an initiative to ask the International Court of Justice of an advisory opinion on the existing legal limits to the veto, specifically in the case of atrocity crimes. So I don't think these are, airy-fairy, Pollyanna-ish ideas that civil society concocts. I think they demand the investment of civil society working with states to bring about action. And where there is a removal of the great power in the room, the elephant in the room, that may happen. We also see this, of course, with the International Criminal Court and with amendments there too, with the crime of aggression, etc. So putting all of that on the table, I'm quite optimistic, actually, about the opportunities for middle states, small states, civil society, and other actors to band together for some seismic change.
Great, thanks so much. All right, please try to keep your comments succinct.
Sorry.
I've got Michael up here, and then I've got some folks up down here who've been waiting for quite a while. So Michael, up at the top, back row there. Please keep your comments succinct. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael Jacobs, University of Sheffield in the UK and ODI Global. I wanted to ask particularly the representatives on the panel who are from the Global South about the idea of coalitions of the willing. The world we're operating in clearly can't work in the way that the UN was meant to, with the Security Council as it is, but there are lots of putative coalitions of the willing, and it was interesting in Seville that once the US walked out, a very large coalition of the willing agreed the outcome text very quickly, thinking we've got much more in common with one another, despite all the differences, than we do with the country that's just left. And then the subsequent action platform for action has a number of coalitions of the willing. And it's in general, it's been developed countries that have said we can do coalitions of the willing and have been rather weak at it amongst themselves, like climate clubs. I just wondered whether, in the absence of the US, the developing countries, as it were, the global south, can conceive that. And then I think in that case, middle powers is not a helpful phrase, because middle powers immediately takes you to that group of large countries, and a coalition of the willing could include some smaller ones, and we have seen some of those. And so I think that middle powers and coalitions of the willing are not the same things, and coalitions of the willing seem to me to be interesting, but only if there are countries who are willing to take part in them, even when they disagree on other issues.
Michael, can you just hang on to that for a second? So can you give us an example of when a coalition of the willing has been able to have an impact and move something effectively?
In practice, funding mechanisms are often coalitions of the willing. So Gavi are not universal, but very widespread. An innovative system which got enough countries to make it happen. And funding mechanisms are an important part of coalitions of the willing because they're often not universal. So I would suggest that as one particular kind of model. And there have been peacekeeping arrangements which are also, in practice, coalitions of the willing, because although they may or may not have been authorized by the UN, they in fact involve a rather small number of countries in them. And it was interesting to hear, for example, the Indonesian president today offering Indonesian troops and logistical support to peacekeeping missions, a country that has not been traditionally involved and so on.
I'm not cutting off your microphone. I don't know what is. So let me ask Josh to just switch. Maybe we take this microphone, one of the microphones here, and then I'm going to ask Gabriel. So we've got John here, and then some of the comments here. Oh yes, right, Nidara. Okay.
So is this me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I'm John Coonrod. I'm the founder of the Movement for Community-Led Development, and I really want to stand with Casitas on subnationalism because, one, I'd be really happy if there weren't nation states, but if you look at how cities have been pushing for real voice at the United Nations, how subnational governments have been taking the most progressive stands on the environment, cities and municipalities around no matter which nation state they are in. You know, the last big rise in authoritarianism in the late 20s and early 30s, social thinkers said, look, the only way to organize society consistent with human dignity is the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity pushes decisions as close to people as possible. So I just strongly believe that a system that's going to be centered on people is going to be centered in having power, resources, autonomy at the local level.
Great, thanks so much. So as you see, the premise of this whole conversation is that, first of all, the people who we should be speaking to are not going to be able to be in this room. But secondly, we thought we'd take then this opportunity to gather ideas from you all as to how we then think about this system. And I just, to some of the opening provocations here, Richard asked us, you know, who's going to keep us safe? So I think these are all really important questions and ideas that you're posing, but there's also some fundamentals about the international system that I think if there's some folks here who have some answers to, that would be really great. So I've got Nudar, Arathi, and then Nicole and Mark. Let's see. Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Minh-Thu. And I do want to be clear, please don't throw this question back at me. Nadara Youssef, I serve as co-chair of Coalition for the UN We Need. Just wondering, in this kind of network-based hub, multi-aligned, or a kind of Gavi style come together on specific coalitions of the willing, thematic, kind of almost decentralized multilateral model that's being proposed. What is the role of consensus here? And or do we just accept the fact that countries will pick and choose the clubs and games they want to play in? If they don't like the rules of the game, they pick another club, they pick another game. That seems sort of a little bit in its own right, like quite scary. And so is there a kind of mediated version of consensus that needs to come about for this new version of multilateralism that you're discussing?
Thank you so much. So actually, you've got Mark right there. So we are running out of time, and I've been sort of given for my co-host, so we got to move on.
I'll ask a
go
very
ahead.
quick and
Great,
genuine
thanks.
question that I don't have the answer to either. Mark Goldberg, I'm the host and editor of Global Dispatches. You know, as the U.S. descends more deeply into authoritarianism here at home and pursues what Stewart characterized as a malevolent foreign policies abroad, are there any near-term actions, concrete actions that middle powers can take to band together to prevent the United States from pursuing some of those malevolent foreign policy decisions?
Oh, love it. Okay, Nicole, right behind you. Nope. Yep.
Yep. I'll also be super quick. Nicole Golden, head of equitable development at UNU Center for Policy Research. And I think, you know, what's been super interesting is to hear the provocations and the way people are talking about middle powers without actually saying who is a middle power. And I think that very question is a provocation in and of itself. Anne-Marie and I were talking, I've been looking into this issue of middle powers, particularly as it relates to development cooperation. And I think one of the things that we see about middle powers is that it can be very contextual. It can be very sectoral. And so maybe an additional provocation just to throw out there is that just like in the context of defining or thinking about who is a middle power, it could be a small power that takes on a leadership role in a particular context. Can the reverse also be true? Can an otherwise, quote, great power or major power who abdicates their leadership in different ways be considered maybe a middle power? And what does that mean then for a system and for a system or group of middle powers? Thanks.
Much, Nicole. So I'm just going to take these last two because we've got to come back. Arathi, and then this gentleman right behind you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Arathi Krishnan. I'm the CEO of Rapture Intelligence Futures. I'm going to be as quick as I can, but I just want to preface this by saying it's very uncomfortable for me to say this when there's so many women on the panel that I deeply admire and have been followers of. This conversation feels like a lament of the loss of our own power versus a recognition of something that is emerging because the current rules-based world order was not serving a lot of us. And I wonder, and again, I'm saying this without judgment, I'm an intelligence analyst, I look at things, you know, from an intelligence perspective. The rise of a transactional diplomacy world order where nation states are now trading for protection of their own resources, sovereignty, because the concepts of equity, sustainability, and whatever means very different things to very different people. The human rights Declaration, if you want to talk about international law, has not protected, as we've seen from my really wonderful commenter from that talked about Gaza. It has failed us. So I wonder if this is an existential crisis of our own centrality that we are lamenting, but versus not recognizing the importance of the rising economic order that is driving a lot of these relationships. And I want to be really clear, and I'm saying this as Arathi Krishnan, not the organization that I run. I take particular offense at who is going to keep us safe. And the gentleman from the back that said, should we have a litmus test for emerging middle powers? Do we have a litmus test for the country that we're set in now? Is everybody in this country treated safe? And sir, I say this with utmost respect for your organization. Who is keeping us safe? The major powers of the world have not kept us safe. And they're certainly not keeping us safe now. And that's the reason why multipolarity exists, because those of us that come from the communities that we come from need to find other ways to keep us safe. Thank you.
All right, great. Sorry, just 30 seconds and then we've got to go because, yeah, our hosts are going. One co-host has to disappear. Okay, sorry.
Joshua Walker from the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. I wanted to pick up on Richard's point about entrepreneurialism and just ask two brief questions. The first is, to what extent are these sort of individual entrepreneurial initiatives by middle powers at odds with a kind of order of a stable order of middle powers? And also, how do we contend then with the kind of the more malignant, let's say, forms of entrepreneurialism that we're seeing in places like Sudan and elsewhere on the African continent in that light?
All right, great. So lightning responses or questions from our panelists for this. So let's just start here and very quickly.
Very stimulating questions. The only thing I would say is that, yes, I think we don't name what's really critical, and that's about power. We are talking of nation states because we essentially are looking at power. And at the moment, cities don't have power, citizens don't have power. That's what we assume. So I feel the tension. We have aspirations which are normative, but we are constantly trying to be very pragmatic in what we are saying. So I would really say that it is about reimagining a feminist global order. It's going to be very different where power is distributed. And that's going to happen through cities, through citizens' action, through civic groups. So that's a quick one.
Look, I think for me, I've really appreciated a lot of the interventions, and I think just really putting a fine point on the fact that system has failed. Those who were not part of building it, and therefore we see kind of this immense dissatisfaction with a system that has not upheld justice, peace, rights, and the things that we really care about. And I think, in the place where I live, Gaza and what has happened completely deteriorates any last bit of faith people had in some sort of functioning international order. So that is where we're at, and we need to work out how we kind of emerge from that level of complete lack of hope.
Yeah, maybe building on that, but trying to take it to the next step. I think that, at least for me, the challenging question here is like, it's not going to be good just because it's different than the past. Okay, the only way it's going to be good is if we actually work in a strategic and smart way to move the pieces in some sort of direction. So here people have been talking about a bunch of different things that have been going on, coalitions of the willing, CISA. I think we need to actually try everything. Right? Like we don't have the luxury here to choose like, okay, this may be the way to go. I think we need to start testing different things and see what works, because actually right now, I don't think that any of us has a model.
Super quickly on 3 points. Zach, to your question, I think in any world there are going to be bits of the UN that keep going. No one thinks we need to replace the Universal Postal Union. And I actually think that there are going to be chunks of the UN that keep functioning perfectly fine. And again, IAEA, you can't really replace that with a network structure, but those could exist alongside a lot of other networks. And then, sorry, by asking who will keep us safe, I didn't wish to imply that the P5 were keeping us safe. I've spent the last 7 years working day in, day out on the Security Council on Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, Ethiopia. I know how fucked up this system is. But I also see a lot of people who talk about middle powers sort of edging away from the security issue because it's hard. And that's why I wanted to put it on the table. And then Jennifer, on council reform, your question raised a really interesting dilemma, and I encourage you at everything you're doing. But what if it worked? What if we actually got a new legal framework which meant that the P5 couldn't use their vetoes? We'd have a middle power order, but it wouldn't involve the US, Russia, and China, because they would walk away and they just wouldn't work through the council. So sometimes we have to be careful of what we wish for.
Thank you. I wanted to connect two of the questions, the booing question, it's Ben, right? And the subsidiarity question. I think they're connected. If we continue to have policies both at the global, national, regional, and city level that mean nothing to people, we're in trouble. And that is why people have lost faith. They're not stupid when they vote for populist governments. They don't feel that the system is serving them. And we just launched today a school meal report that we did at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, co-produced with WFP, the World Food Program. And the idea is really to start with the Sustainable Development Goals, to not give up on them, to not say blah, 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 blah. They were treated as blah, 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 blah. They didn't come down to earth and get people excited about them, making sure, as Brazil is doing, as Sweden is trying to do, as Scotland is starting to do, that every child has access to not just school lunch, free school lunch, and not ketchup as a vegetable school lunch that Reagan wanted to do to keep the cost low, but healthy, tasty, sustainable school lunch, getting kids involved and learning about that throughout the curriculum, but also designing that lunch, using it again to transform public-private partnerships, so it's not just a contract moving money here and there, but actually bold missions that are on something as concrete as the lunchroom, like really taking each of the SDGs and asking what would be the equivalent to that. And the other thing still on food, I had the experience in my own neighborhood in Camden of just seeing the difference of the facial expression of women walking into a food bank, because inequality, as we heard, is alive and well and getting worse in many countries, and the difference with the food cooperative, a green food cooperative, that sense of ownership, dignity, where the actual food that's being delivered might be the same, but in a completely different way, where one is valuing and really providing self-worth. And if we look at so much crime amongst youth in many cities, it is very much related to kind of self-hate and people not having felt valued. All these great studies on the relative inequality, even though in the absolute terms people might be getting better. If someone's just doing so much better than you next door in this kind of postcode wars, for example, that we have in London, going after that means having extreme empathy, but actually changing how people feel in their everyday life in terms of how policy is again governed and owned in a way that not just puts them first at them, but puts them at the center of designing those policies.
Thanks. Responding to three questions. First one on Josh's really interesting question. Would there be a litmus test for democracy? And in some ways I wish, but no, I don't think it's wise. I think that in partly because it's so associated with this notion that of U.S. foreign policy and of sort of overreach in terms of democracy promotion. I think that there could be certain, there's no stopping clubs of particular middle powers from advancing democracy, but I think that it would probably be a distraction in terms of trying to make an overall litmus test, because of course you get in the same problem that was as Biden's democracy summit, and you sort of parsing amongst who's a partial democracy, who's an autocracy, and sometimes you just need countries that are capable and are interested with you in this particular area. So no. Zach's a really interesting question too. Yeah, don't we already have this? It's called the United Nations. Awesome question. And I thought about that too. I mean, I've done a lot of writing between what's the relationship between prefix menu of standing international organizations and institutions and the a la carte menu that we're talking about here, right? And at some point, do we reach sort of peak minilateralism? That's an interesting question, right? There's all these high ambition coalitions, et cetera. But I do think that the key is, and this is the general for all countries, is to try to mix and match these things, or to make sure that they're what Bob Cohane, the late Bob Cohane used to, or still with us? Yeah, still with us. Yeah, very much so. Good. I didn't want to sort of create a newsworthy event. I think I was thinking about his former co-author, but Bob wrote about really interesting about multilateralism supporting sort of minilateral cooperation versus that distracts from it. What you want to try to do is use high ambition coalitions and minilateralism to try to get people to up their game and have others join you. And you saw that in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. You've also seen it in how the Financial Action Task Force was originally created. And finally, on Rebecca's interest, but I do think, I should say, I don't think all international problems should be dealt with a pickup game like it's a basketball. I mean, you just can't do that. You need to link it to standing organizations with legitimacy and universality and technical competency you need over the long haul. On Rebecca's really interesting question, this issue of the collapse of international humanitarian law, the rising impunity amongst great powers, and their allies who are being protected is a huge issue. On UN Security Council reform, I've tilted at that windmill, even got Richard Gowan to write a chapter for me on a compendium on it. But I do think more recently, there has been a lot of interesting work on sort of non-charter amendments efforts to try to advance UN Security Council reform, veto initiative, a whole bunch of other things that have been done to try to call, the permanent members to the table and force them to explain what the hell they're doing. And again, it's maybe seemed to be thin gruel compared to the more structural things, but I think it's important.
Thanks. I think a lot of the comments are really rich and needs discussions on their own, but perhaps I want to comment on the other side of the question about who keeps us safe. Perhaps is who threatens us and why and how, right? Who coerces us, coercion, why and how is it possible? So you mentioned Gaza, Amitabh, and the fact that it really sort of pulled the veil of what is civil, what is civilizational, who promotes human rights, and impunity is not a new thing. Institutionalized impunity has been with us for at least the last 7 decades. And we've seen exceptionalism in the case of Israel for 7 decades, which has given rise to this. And that impunity is associated with big powers. Okay. So it talks about the coalition of the willing, how do we get together? There's a notion that we're not discussing enough, is the freedom of association of states. Right? So when states get together around, for example, the Hague Group was formed, a loose coalition saying, how do we ensure that there's accountability and justice? The discussion was rich in the sense that most of the members were state parties to the Rome Statute, some were not, and those who were not felt we should be, actually. And we had discussions about the limits and potentials of a treaty-based institution like the ICC. For example, the crime of aggression. It's interesting, the countries that firstly blocked the crime of aggression from being under the jurisdiction of the ICC are all the big powers. Then they lost the argument with other state parties and they made it an opt-in crime, and we're trying to undo that, because how do you make a crime an opt-in one? So that gives us a sense that impunity has been with us for a while, and coercion is, and power linked to coercion is ever present within the multilateral system. Right, so we've got, all of us are in some ways umbrella states, sort of under the umbrella of one or two powerful countries. Who keeps us safe? Is it NATO? Or is NATO, a form of coercion? These are discussions that we should have. Linked to that, and the fact that there is a limit on freedom of association of states, because the moment we formed the Hague Group, we were seen as hostile by many of the big powers, particularly the US, but some others as well. We felt that, why are you trying to be a judge on what is right and what is wrong? And it's not about us, it's about what the international system is saying, that we're trying to reform, that we were the legal, the subalterns of the legal order, and now we've sort of using it to keep the most powerful and the allies accountable, and that is offending the most powerful, because the system was designed for them, not for us. And I think this is something that has created the tensions that we see. There's 2 bills on the Hill in Washington, D.C. that if they pass, people like myself and others who are using, through our states, the institutions of global government would be sanctioned as individuals, like Francisca Albanese has been, right? And that impunity also comes with another dimension that we're not discussing, and I think the question about people and power is important. And the issue of democracy. So a lot of the authoritarian states and leaders we see did not come in through some form of coup. They were elected into power. Okay. So there's a support base that seems to find these kinds of authoritarian actions, impunity, injustice, palatable. And I think, perhaps the failure of the new liberal system over the last 3 decades that many of us have been warning about has given rise to that, because people feel the system has failed. And so willing to give up freedom and democracy for security. But there's a cost to that, and I think the point that we need to do is how do we get civil society to mobilize differently? How do you make sure, and this is a discussion we just had the other day, Amitabh, how do we ensure that instead of just writing papers and marching, but actually contesting for power, so that we do get to the point where we can change the culture, this martial culture I spoke about, to one that genuinely begins to talk about collaboration, peace, and justice. And you're not going to get that when we have civil society doing the right things and mobilizing, but actually still reluctant to contest for power. And then those who contest for power are the ones who really are not interested in the main around these justice collaboration. So the system will continue. The institutions that then support a martial culture will continue. And we need to actually build a different culture, both working together with governments and civil society. And that will take time, but it does take organizing, it does take care. You need to build a level of consciousness. And people always ask, how do you measure consciousness? It's the number of people and organizations who believe in a thing and work towards it. And perhaps that's what we need to do. This culture of peace is one that we should take seriously. It's not something that should be seen as soft or willy-nilly. It's about what keeps us safe, and it's not military. It's really equality, it's dignity, it's justice. And how do we mobilize towards that? And that's the discussion we should be having.
So I've learned a lot in the last hour and a half. I've changed my own thinking. I do want to just start by saying I, for one, am not in mourning for this system I've been writing about UN reform since I started as a scholar. It's been so clear that it was designed for a different world, and it was designed for a world of 50-odd nations, and we are 200 nations, and it's deeply unjust. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the question of do we build on it, we're not going to just tear it down, is important, but just for the record. But three things in response to a number of questions. First, I realized that actually what I'm calling for is not middle powers. It is coalitions of the willing. The ICC wouldn't have happened without small states. It is, and much of the climate work is due to small states. So no, I am thinking about a flexible multilateral set of arrangements in which states that want to act and can come together should. So that's very helpful. Second, and I didn't, to me, the other shift that we need, I was talking about dominance to connection and, hierarchy to network, but is a move from a state-centered system to a framework that I call people, state, and planet. For those of you who are international relations people, I'm riffing off of Ken Walt's Man, the State, and War, which was the basis of a lot of realist IR writing. But I actually think we do need a people-centered order, but we absolutely still need states and governments. I mean, we're not going back to the Middle Ages. And we need to have the planet, we need to be thinking about the planet as a force, as it very much is, but also as an object of, it's not just peace and security, it's peace, security, and planetary survival and sustainability. And I think there are ways to formalize that understanding of global politics. We have operated, in a state-centric system, and it's time to move, not to get rid of them, but to move ahead. And finally, I would not have democracy as a criterion. I did write with John Eikenberry about the desire for a community of democracies, but that was 2006, and I've changed my view. What I would do, I would probably have states sign, I think they should score at a certain place on the anti-corruption index. I don't think the US would qualify at the moment. The Human Development Index, and Freedom House. I think it is civil and political and economic, social, and cultural rights. I think if we are talking about people, we need to focus on how well states serve their people. And if you look at China from that lens, China, India, others have, but China has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That counts for something. I don't know what that criterion would look like. I think it's also critical that people sign up to rules they actually intend to enforce and obey, which we also have not done for a very long time. But I would certainly make those measures really important in terms of the values this partnership, coalition, whatever it is trying to serve. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Minh-Thu for really wonderful moderating. I also want to thank this amazing panel for being able to get through in 5 minutes, pretty much. I did not think that was possible. And really all of you, the audience, this was a really sustained, provocative discussion, and we need many more of them. So thanks from New America, and over to Project Starling.
Great, thank you so much. This was incredible. And maybe my provocation is, just given this conversation, could we all come up with the list of principles and values that we think the new or renewed global, to use your word, renewed global order should look like? And then start to draft out what that plan is. And then what are the speeches and the directives and the memos and the sort of, executive orders that need to then be written and then executed that will start to put in place the actions that will then lead to this maybe more egalitarian global order that we want. So I think there is a crisis, but there's also an opportunity to really start acting on it. And so just to say, I think us at Project Starling, and hopefully with New America and other partners here, is to see, let's just start to put that down on paper. Let's just start to sketch out what that plan looks like so we can actually start to build that order starting today. All right, thanks so much. There is a garden reception upstairs, and I hope you stay. There'll be some food and hors d'oeuvres and some drinks as well. So thanks so much for joining us.